Hello, hello. We're back. Both of us are back. We're both here.
Yes.
And we're both wearing our fancy shirts.
Yes, we are.
Our fancy show shirts. Yeah, I'm back. I'm fully recovered. Well, I'm not fully recovered, but I'm like functionally recovered.
I'm glad you're feeling better. We missed you on last week's show. I realize that I can fly solo, but it is not as fun.
Yeah, I would imagine that producer Ben's not gonna offer a lot here. Yeah, we love Ben. Thank you so much for joining us for GPS Live for the week of January 12th. Our second GPS Live of the year, my first. We are so grateful that you are here to join us. Go ahead and talk to us in the comments. We we love seeing you guys interact with the show and talk to us. Let us know your thoughts on the stories as we're going through them. We love to involve you in the conversation. And if you're watching this on demand, please absolutely still let us know that you're here, and give us some feedback. Let us know what kind of stories you'd love to see us cover in the next week. If you've got story ideas, we can pull those from the comments. That's all great stuff that we love. Thank you so much for giving us that time. But before we get kicking off with the actual show itself, we need to go ahead and say that our views and opinions are our own. They don't necessarily reflect the views and opinions officially of GuidePoint Security. We're just two dudes who are talking about the stories we found. Jonathan, how was your cybersecurity week?
My cybersecurity week was wonderful because it wasn't packed full of incidents for once. As our viewers will see, a lot of interesting things have indeed happened in the news. But luckily for me, it was quite calm around these parts. It is awkwardly cold here in Florida. That's all I gotta say.
It's awkwardly cold in a lot of places. I think Seattle's gearing up for like somewhere between -10 and 4 degrees over the next weekend or week. I think that's
miserable.
Yeah, if I read the weather reporting, apparently it's like a huge cold wave coming across. So bundle up if you're watching this on demand, because you're probably going to need to prep for it. Go to the grocery store. Stop worrying about whether computers are getting hacked and start worrying about whether your fridge is stocked. And then hope that your fridge is not internet connected. But anyway, our first story this week, you and Ben found some really interesting stuff.
Yes.
This week. And the first one that we're going to talk about is kind of like a fun exploration of what's possible out there. What I am dubbing the Internet of Tools is apparently vulnerable to ransomware. This is an interesting story from Ars Technica.
So what's happening here is I'd say you and I and most of our viewers are fairly well aware of the fact that you can connect anything to the internet these days. I don't know why. Ovens and microwaves and washers and dryers and thermostats and front door locks, right? We're used to that lifestyle. Well, the latest addition to the Internet of Things collection is tools. And we're talking mechanics tools, stuff like you find in a workshop, those at dealerships and service centers. And so this article is speaking to a particular cordless, almost like an air ratchet, but it is a cordless ratchet that has Wi-Fi, and it can speak to other computers that are on the network. It has a web-based controller interface. Ideally, the thought process behind this is if you're performing a particular service by the service manual, certain bolts need to be torqued down to certain specifications, 150 foot-pounds of torque plus a quarter turn, right?
Yeah.
And historically, you would program these on your torque wrench. Now you could use one of these smart, automatically tuned based off of your service progress ratchets, except for the fact that it's extremely vulnerable, right?
It's extremely vulnerable. So, I mean, like, yeah, the theory behind this is good, right? We're eliminating human error. There's plenty to point to, right? There's an old story about British Airways where a plane's windscreen was not tightened in properly with the proper bolts.
Are we really going down this path right now?
And blew out. There's the recent story about the plane that just lost the door that wasn't actually a door that was there, right? All of those things are really important, and that stuff can happen because of human error with like grabbing the wrong bolt, grabbing the wrong torque spec, not tightening things enough, over tightening things. All that can lead to a problem. So you eliminate that by saying, well, here are the exact specs, and this tool will just connect to Wi-Fi, and you just put in like, I'm working on bolt XYZ, and it automatically grabs those specs and does it for you. That's really wonderful. The problem is that with the implementation of the software itself on the tools themselves, is I think the number that I saw in this story was 23 vulnerabilities
yes.
that they found that allow them to access these tools, which are then connected to your network, and they can do something like infect the tool itself with ransomware. And when you're talking about, an automotive shop, right, that could ruin someone's day if their car, their car suddenly just stops working because a few bolts were over tightened, and that led them to strip, and then their head gasket blew off. But when you're talking about something like an aircraft hangar or, a military maintenance tent in the middle of Afghanistan or something like that, right? These are incredibly important things. You can't have these tools just suddenly stop working. But even more dangerous would be exploiting those vulnerabilities to change the settings that the tool is applying at the point that you're trying to tighten that bolt down, leading to over tightening. And this is actually a really interesting topic that one of our folks here at GuidePoint, Pascal Ackerman, who's an expert on IoT security and the expansion into like IT and OT and how those things are intertwined. He wrote an incredibly detailed blog post researching how he was actually able to take over the interface for some OT devices and manipulate the data so that people, so that it would make an operator think that like, oh, this tech is operating outside of spec and take action. And so, he wrote that incredible post. I'm going to go, actually, Ben, could you find that post on GuidePoint's blog? It's by Pascal, Pascal Ackerman. If you could find that for us and drop it in the chat, that would be really helpful. But he's an expert on that, and he's been talking about this for a long time. The more that we integrate the tools and the devices we use into the network, the more vulnerable we become, because while we're trying to remove the element of human error, we are introducing the element of exposure and risk.
Yeah. So some of the vulnerabilities of the 23 that were talked about is a number of things. One, for instance, being an absolute denial of service, as you mentioned. Imagine a mechanic being unable to do their job with these fancy new internet-connected wrenches. Other things include absolutely compromising the embedded system and displaying arbitrary messages on the tool itself. It does have a little color LCD screen and different messages, different specs. But in this case, the example shows your wrench has been backed by malware. Pay us a Bitcoin, right?
I love that they named their test malware Drill Crypt.
Drill Crypt, yes.
Drill Crypt is great.
And a number of other things too, right? As you mentioned, potentially forging or falsifying data, similar to like what a rootkit would do in an environment, which is hide itself and make everything look like it's normally functioning, although things are nefarious. Things are absolutely happening in the background, and so I could only imagine this being kind of an obscure, what we consider Internet of Things device, only being the start. Continue to keep an eye on a lot of those products that we already use today. Like I said, thermostats, door locks, and then from the industrial control space, from the commercial space with building controls and elevators. But now we've successfully moved on from microwaves and toasters and ovens to wrenches.
Wrenches. We're on to wrenches now.
They if I recall correctly, I believe there was also a series of drills that also had some firmware embedded interesting things. In fact, I don't want to go down this rabbit hole, but I believe there was DRM and batteries for certain hand drills. And I feel like this is a direction that things might go in with that too.
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah, it's going to be interesting to kind of watch the way that this is handled. I believe the company that manufactures these has already started releasing patches
Yes.
and trying to get around this. I believe they are
They're
working
taking
with.
it very seriously.
Yeah,
They are researching it. They are implementing patches, and they are taking the advice of the individual research teams that have submitted all of their findings.
yeah. Um, So yeah, that's an interesting story that we'll continue to keep an eye on. But it does kind of lead us into some of our next stories, right? The risk of the risk of the technologies that we embed into our lives to make things easier being taken over. I'm gonna skip one in the order and go to the right to the NIST one,
Okay.
I think, and then we can come back. Um,
Yeah.
so our next story is we're returning to NIST. NIST once again has released some statements about risks that are out there in cybersecurity. And this time it is interesting because they are talking about AI and the way that we are embedding it into our lives. And this one comes to us from, I believe, State Scoop
Yes.
and the Hacker News are where we pulled these.
Absolutely. And so, the AI very much so is a broad term across the industry today. But the warnings, particularly coming to us from this, is the fact that these platforms can still be abused. Think of it how our communication channels regarding how we interact with social media and our news today can be abused with misinformation. Well, equally, our adversaries can abuse our dependence on AI in our daily lives. Everybody is very hot and heavy on ChatGPT and OpenAI's capabilities. We're also seeing advancement from a number of other companies like Google with Bard and Meta's
Mhm.
own AI tools that are going to be coming out. But the conversation is now shifting to, what can adversaries do to damage or hurt the information that's fed into these systems to cause
Right.
an outcome that is more favorable to the adversary and not so much to the consumer. And so they've put together a very extensive report. You feel free to pull down a copy of it off from this website. It is a very long read, but there's quite a few highlights that are called out. So Tristan, what were some of those different types of attacks that they are harping on?
Yeah, so they cover on a few different kinds of attacks. You've got like evasion attacks, poisoning attacks, privacy risks that come with AI, right? The amount of data that it's collecting and things like that, and then just abuse of the system in general. Some of the some of the things that you would see there would be like from the evasion side of things, right? When we're looking at using AI to drive our cars is the most common example, right? Someone defacing traffic signs. So, altering a stop sign in a way that like the AI system is no longer able to recognize it as a stop sign. And so it breezes right through. Or taking things like road markings, right? And deliberately altering road markings in a way that the AI will see, but maybe a person won't notice so readily. Especially in the heat of the moment when you're going 60, 75 miles an hour down the highway, right? To alter the traffic pattern of cars. This is actually something that was seen a lot just a few years ago, right? With the early versions of self-driving software in
Yes.
cars, is that a lane would be shut down for maybe there was an accident or maybe they're doing maintenance on the road, but the AI was unable to recognize the change in lane structure because it was early on, it was right after the accident, so they just set out road flares or something like that, right? The AI wasn't trained on that model, so it barrels right through. People then see that and say, well, if the AI can fail to recognize this thing, perhaps I can force it to recognize another thing and use that to my advantage. And that comes in, right, that leads into the other strain of attack, which we've talked about before, which is poisoning attacks, right? Forcing the AI to learn something that it should not learn.
Yes.
That is a huge risk in our current landscape when we're talking about misinformation, disinformation, and we're looking at using AI tools to do things like cybersecurity. And we're looking at AI tools to do things like healthcare. If you start poisoning that data and giving it bad data, imagine we just got done experiencing the real ramifications of the Move It attacks, right? an adversary was able to get into MOVEit's infrastructure and sit there for years, or not years, but months before they deployed anything. And because of that, we're able to, affect customers worldwide and have this drastic impact. If an adversary were able to get in and start poisoning an AI model well in advance of any kind of attack that they wanted to do, they could train an AI model to ignore the signs of their particular attack before they launch it.
Absolutely. And then rounding off, some of the other attacks that you mentioned, so privacy attacks, this kind of is a multifold. One of them is what kind of sensitive information exists within the model that is maybe not apparently visible or available with basic standard questions, but with certain prompts, it can be extracted or discovered, or even going further as to what training data the model was built on. Normally, that kind of stuff right now is considered more or less a trade secret. And we've seen some breakouts, right? Jailbreaks of dumping of training data through some of these large language models, and that continues to be a challenge to this day.
And then finally, too, I think the recent one was just asking the AI to say the word poem over and over and over again, until
repeat something to infinitum, and that caused it to suddenly puke out raw strings of training data, which was very interesting. And then finally, we have abuse attacks, right? And that is simply just to compromise the legitimate source of information that it's intended to use. And so, across these types of different attacks, this is more or less what's been called out. And as you mentioned, right, this isn't just ChatGPT. This is text-based, voice-based, image-based, video-based, and also in the automotive and other camera-based sectors that are reviewing. I know a lot of modern doorbells and other home surveillance systems are starting to get to the point where they could recognize people, packages, cars, and even license plates, right? And if you have a configuration, for instance, I know at my house, if you are a person or a package and you're near my doorbell, I get a different type of alert rather than just random movement because some squirrel has entered the frame.
I got one last night from my doorbell that was really great. I just got an alert that said pet has been detected, and I went and clicked on it, and it was just a raccoon like walking around my front
yard. That's cool.
Beautiful. I have AI. Thank AI.
Yeah.
But the NIST calls out that in the report that they wrote and in their warnings, right, they did work with different researchers. I believe Ali Fordyce and Hiram Anderson. Ali Fordyce and Hiram Anderson are the names, to break down each of these classes of attacks. And they do make some recommendations for approaches to mitigate this kind of attack if you're going to be leveraging AI in your organization and in your environment. But they note very importantly that the defenses that they are recommending are incomplete at best, right? This is such a new area that the most we can kind of do at this point is theorize about how to stop this kind of thing, because it's a smart learning system. So, right, that means that if it's learning and we've come up with one way to stop this kind of attack or abuse from happening, attackers can also just outthink that and ask the system to do something else that gets them to the same end goal. So this is going to be an area of cybersecurity that's going to be constantly evolving and updating. But that kind of I think leads nicely into our other story about AI. So what do we have going on here, Jonathan?
So come to us from Yahoo Finance is a bit of a hot topic that was actually in a lot of major news channels this week, was the idea specifically of OpenAI, the company behind ChatGPT, as we've just mentioned, talking about its case regarding intellectual property. Right. And there was a number of quotes that you and I heard from the news itself, along from what's coming out of this article. But the question really becomes is, what was OpenAI's training data, and is that allowed to be simply scraped because maybe it's publicly accessible, or is it considered proprietary? Oftentimes you'll see warnings of this content cannot be reproduced or reused for any other purposes, like the NFL. And does that same kind of concept apply to news publications or encyclopedia articles or other maybe scholarly journals that training data is being built off of if it is technically publicly accessible rather than behind some kind of corporate paywall.
Yeah. And it's it's an interesting thing, right? The OpenAI, the CEO has come out and said like, hey, our business model relies on being able to access this stuff, and gain access to it. And that overarching question of like, once it's out in the world, does it count? And I think it comes back to a question of usage, right? One of the things that we had been talking about just before the show started was like, what's the real functional difference between a person reading an article on the New York Times and then going and having a conversation with someone else about what they saw in that article. That other person now has that information without having to read the New York Times. So what's the difference between that and a robot? And I think the difference comes down to like the usage, the end usage of it, right? In that case, that third person who never saw the New York Times article, one, knows it came from the New York Times, probably. Their friend probably said, like, I read this article in the New York Times. But two, they just have that information now. And if they go and take that information and do something else with it that is transformative, right? They write their own think piece on it, whatever. The chain is very visible there. Whereas with the AI side of things, it's not necessarily visible. The AI may not tell you, hey, I learned all this stuff from these 400 sources that I read. Mm-hmm. But on top of that, most people are not just having a conversation with an AI to learn something, they're asking it to write something for them, right? So they're asking it to do the transformative work already. And that is directly, that is that company then taking that work and directly kind of profiting off that, which is an interesting thing. But where I think it gets interesting with cybersecurity, in particular, is we're looking at implementing these kinds of tools in our environment, right? So what data is that our AI cybersecurity tools really going to be trained on? How are they going to continue to access that data so that they stay up to date? And then more importantly, at what point does this copyright claim start to impact that, right? Like, so if an AI is out there and it reads a post on a forum about like a specific set of features that one cybersecurity product is implementing in order to, crack down on attack method A, and then it takes all of that and transforms it into some new policies for something else. But it turns out that forum post was actually made by an employee of that cybersecurity company. And so it's proprietary, right? Like, at what point do we start crossing into this weird kind of gray zone where it's like, well, that was actually, now you're learning from proprietary tech that we have as opposed to just open information. I think it'll be a very interesting conversation as we see this stuff move forward.
So kind of up to now, most of the models that we're familiar with were basically trained on just kind of scouring what was available on the internet and other kind of, published documents. And there wasn't a whole lot of thought in copyright. But as we're starting to see more to kind of, as they say, calm the concerns over potential infringement charges, companies like OpenAI are already starting to talk to different publishers and kind of ink some licensing deals. Companies like CNN and Fox and Time Magazine, for instance, are a couple of the outlets that are in chats with OpenAI simply to help get ahead of these things and say, listen, we're in a position to allow you to use our content and our copyrighted material in your training models so that they don't magically show up. But there's still going to be all kinds of different things, popping up. We saw in the art space, right? Companies like Midjourney, for instance, and finding that some of these image generation things are based off of copyrighted, paintings and photography and galleries of maybe even small artists, and their work is being directly used to influence reproductions in a number of different areas, absolutely without their permission. And that's a tough one, because in the image space, we have companies like Getty Images, for instance. You go and you post copy paste of a licensed photo somewhere on the internet, you will receive a cease and desist immediately. Right. But we're not seeing that same kind of impact with these different AI platforms. So,
it'll be a very interesting space to watch as these tools become more integrated, and pairing that with NIST's warnings about how we are leveraging AI in our environments, right? So now we're adding in another way that AI could be a risk to you if you're using it, right? Does it open you up to copyright infringement lawsuits?
Add that to the list of poisoning and
yeah, abuse and privacy.
there you go.
Yeah,
Perfect.
exactly. But we've got one more story that we want to cover that is, I think, very, very interesting because I was up late last night working on the GuidePoint Research and Intelligence Team annual ransomware report. A lot of really great information that's going to be coming out in about 2 weeks, I believe. A lot of really great, interesting analysis and information in there. Tons of stuff to cover. But this particular group, I have heard the name of so much in working with them. Medusa. And the reason the story is so interesting is that the Medusa ransomware group, which is separate from Medusa Locker, those are two separate strains of ransomware and two separate, affiliate gangs, has launched a new extortion site. And this is something that's really interesting because over the last year, Grit has talked a lot about increasing extortion methodologies within the ransomware space. So, before it was just, hey, we encrypted your files, pay us. Then it became, hey, we encrypted them and stole them. Now we're going to release them. Then you've got groups like Alpha, which is AlphaV, if you're trying to look them up. They're doing stuff like reporting companies to the Securities and Exchange Commission because they're saying you haven't reported your breach fast enough. So a lot of incredible things are going on there, but Medusa is really upping the game when it comes to extortion because their leak site, it actually has a menu of things that you can pay for with prices based on the size of your organization to either buy more time or say, oh, please just delete the data that you stole from me, but I'm not necessarily interested in decryption or anything like that. So you can kind of a la carte menu your way through your negotiation process through their website. And they specifically say on there, all these options have price tags based on the organization that is impacted by the group. But another interesting thing about this is that they have specifically they've started publishing names on this site and leaking the names of their victims on this site. And if I'm reading it correctly, they're doing it before that timer expires for the ransomware, which typically you don't get published until after. That was one of the extortion methods that these groups used, pay up or we'll tell everyone that we hacked you. Now they're publishing, it seems like, beforehand with a countdown timer to whenever the stolen data is going to be released, and a view counter so that you can see how many people have looked at that specific package of data to see the test info or whatever that they've put in there. That is an insane amount of escalation in the ransomware space.
It's kind of really sad because they're playing on additional pressure, additional fears by posting the names, posting the ransom amounts publicly, posting the demands, posting that view counter, even going as far as operating a support channel for communications and even having a media team that's doing things like branding. This truly is cybercrime operations through and through, similar to what we used to see from back in the day with mob, and gang stuff when it was really rampant, and trying to feel and operate as if you're some kind of legitimate business for some reason. So the massive increase that we're seeing, and you and I were talking before the show, you mentioned this has only been around, the past year and a half or so.
Yeah,
completely new to the scene, and already trying to hit the ground running, operate as a game changer, and put pressure on more and more victims.
Well, and that's actually an interesting thing about their timeline as an organization is that they emerged in late 2022. They really hit the ground running with operations in 2023. But if you look at the timeline, the Telegram channel specifically that was set up for IT support, right? Or their support channel, it's also where they share compromised organizations' files through, just they'll just publish stuff there. But that channel was set up in July of 2021. So while they didn't emerge until late 2022, that means that there was over a year of just planning and laying the framework and the groundwork and building a foundation much the same way that you would go about things if you were starting a company, right? You're going to buy your URLs first. You're going to set up your websites. You're going to like get all that laid out before you go public. And that's exactly the way that they did this, which indicates a really high level of, of operational planning and forethought went into this. This was not just a group that started and then somehow kind of like became bigger and bigger over time. They had plans to be a big impact force within the ransomware space.
Absolutely. And my last statement, I know we are at time here, is remember that the advice of the FBI is to never pay ransoms and don't engage with ransomware players. Always consult your cyber insurance and make sure that you're staying safe online.
Yeah, absolutely. That is what they tell you to do. But that does, like you said, bring us to the top of the hour. We're just a little bit over here. Thank you so much for joining us. If you've been here for the whole time, if just for a part of it, even, and if you've been on demand, like we said at the beginning, thank you so much for giving us some of your time. Please go ahead and leave comments on the post about things that you'd like to see us cover, anything that we could use moving forward. Ben has been doing an awesome job posting all of the stories that we've been talking about in the comments. So you have direct links to those. Again, thanks for joining us, and we will see you all next week. See you later.